Hey everyone, welcome to our NAGT webinar for this week. We are super excited to have you all here with us. Just a couple quick reminders that all NAGT events we require that you abide by the NAGT Code of Conduct. Many of you have probably already seen it, but if you have not, the link is in the chat, so please take a look at that and make sure we follow by all of those rules and regulations. During the presentation today, we will ask that you guys keep your cameras off and your microphones muted just to allow this to be a safe space for our speakers and for everybody else. If you have any questions or comments along the way, please feel free to put those into the chat box. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation, and there will be time for question and answers at the end of the presentation. With that, I will pass it over to Catherine to get us started.
Thanks so much, Bradley. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the relevant time zone. My name is Catherine Rihimaki. I am Research Director at Second Nature Software, which works on stormwater science and compliance. So if you have any projects in mind, let me know related to that. I am so pleased to welcome all of you to this fantastic webinar, Climate Survey of the Geosciences, Disproportionate Impacts on Historically Excluded Groups. Today's webinar is brought to us by an NSF grant to support the NAGT Early Career Workshop and associated programming to strengthen the geosciences. Later this spring, there will be additional webinars on inclusive research practices from Hendrada Ali, inclusive teaching practices from Lisa White and Phoebe Cohen, and on valuing DEI efforts when it comes to promotion and tenure, a panel featuring Tessa Hill, Aaron Velasco, Joshua Villalobos, and Aradhana Tripathi. So please keep an eye out for announcements for those webinars. I'm pleased to welcome Ben Labs, who is co-leader of the Early Career Workshop, to say a few words about it. Ben?
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everyone, and thanks for being here today. The Early Career Workshop for Geoscience faculty, something you may have heard of, is going to be continuing this year. It's supported by the same grant that's supporting this webinar today. And we're hoping that we will return to having an in-person workshop at the University of Maryland this summer. So if that's something that you would be interested in, it's a great experience. It's a week-long workshop where early career faculty who are involved in teaching, research, mentoring, get to meet with other faculty in their same position in their career. And get to talk about best practices, get to go through some professional development, share resources, share strategies, things like that. So we do have an application that's available and an application deadline that's coming up within the next couple of weeks here. So I'm just adding to the chat the website. Oh, you already did that, Catherine. Thank you. So if you're interested, please check it out or share with colleagues in your network who may be interested. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. And for those of you who have attended this workshop in the past, you know how fantastic it is. Please, if you are eligible, consider attending. If you have early career colleagues who would be eligible, encourage them to attend as well. With that, it is now my pleasure to introduce today's webinar leader, Erica Marin Spiota, professor of geography at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Her research focuses on biogeochemistry, biogeography, and global change. Erica is also the head of the ADVANCEGeo program. This is an NSF-funded project that works to transform the geoscience workplace environment by addressing the problem of harassment and other exclusionary behaviors such as bullying, discrimination, and identity-based aggressions. So with that, I welcome Erica to speak with us about Climate Survey of the Geosciences, Disproportionate Impacts on Historically Excluded Groups. Erica.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me and thanks for joining me. Okay, We will have time for questions at the end, but if you have questions throughout, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat and maybe some of the Catherine, and I know there's some other members of my team here who can look at the chat as well. And then hopefully we'll have a good discussion at the end. Great, so I'm here to share some findings of a climate survey of the geosciences. And I want to acknowledge that this is a collaborative research project. And so I have a number of collaborators on the ADVANCEGeo Partnership, specifically some co-authors on the manuscript that we hope to submit real soon with these findings. And I want to recognize especially the work of Emily Diaz-Vallejo, who's my PhD student who did the data analysis, and then my co-authors. And I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. I'm joining you today from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dijope since time immemorial. The Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory in 1832. We commit to acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this and all territories. We commit to honor and respect the many indigenous peoples still connected to the lands from which we gather remotely. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that connect us together today, and feel free to add your own land acknowledgement in the chat if you would like to do so. And this is important because as geoscientists, both as educators and researchers, we're often really interested in understanding the history of our landscapes. And in addition to understanding the physical, chemical, and biological histories of our landscapes, it's really important that we recognize the human history of our landscape and recognize the histories of exclusion that have taken place both in the places where we do our research, the places where we train students, and the places where we work. And that's especially relevant to thinking about workplace climate and the topic of today. So the ADVANCEGeo Partnership is a multi-institutional collaborative project funded by the National Science Foundation Advance Program. As a partnership, we also have collaborated with professional societies, starting with American Geophysical Union, Association for Women Geoscientists, and the Earth Science Women's Network. And over the project, we've added some new partners, the Soil Science Society of America, Geological Society of America, and Ecological Society of America. And just a quick summary of what our project is doing. We have developed and delivered right now over 100 bystander intervention and workplace climate training program with discipline-specific scenarios that are relevant to geoscientists and that incorporate intersectionality and thinking about the disproportionate impact that different historically excluded groups experience in the lab, in the classroom, and in the field. We have collected data on workplace climate, and that's what I'm going to be sharing today. We've been developing educational materials that identify harassment, bullying, and discrimination as research misconduct, and ultimately developing a sustainable model that can be transferred to other disciplines in partnership with professional societies. So why the geosciences? You've probably by now all seen a number of different graphs showing how the geosciences are one of the least diverse fields in STEM, right, in terms both of gender and racial and ethnic diversity. And we've seen persistent trends of underrepresentation at all levels, but especially at levels of senior levels and leadership positions. At the same time, the geosciences, there are some things that might be especially relevant and unique to the geosciences, but we're not that different from other STEM disciplines. And what I mean by that is that what we learn from the geosciences can inform what we try to do in other disciplines. And also more importantly, is we can learn from work done in other disciplines in terms of advancing equity, diversity, inclusion, and access, and apply that to our own discipline as well. So there's been a long suite of research documenting gender and racial biases across STEM disciplines, including the geosciences. And this is a laundry list of important career milestones or kind of important points in scientific and educational research careers where this bias has been documented. The references in blue are specific to the geosciences, but you can see anywhere from the ratings of job applications, postdoc reference letters, access to resources and salaries, referee invitations, awards, invisible labor. And of course, we know that there's been disproportionate impact of COVID-19 as well on scientific careers. So there's been a lot of work focused on bias. And our project has been thinking, beyond bias and thinking about active exclusionary behaviors that contribute to long-term persistence of underrepresentation and feelings of being unwelcome. And so when our team recently published a paper led by Dr. Asmaret Assefa-Berhe, who's here joining us today, in Nature Geoscience, thinking about replacing this model of the leaky pipeline, passive model of attrition as you go forward in scientific careers, with this idea of a vicious hostile obstacle course, to really recognize that people leave our fields not only passively, but because they're actively excluded at times. And those are the kinds of behaviors that I'm going to be talking about today. So in summary, the take-home message from our climate survey findings are: one, that workplace experiences in the geosciences differ by gender, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability status, and career stage. Two, historically excluded groups experience more negative workplace environments and are more likely to report negative career outcomes. And three, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts should address hostile behavior effects on careers and retention in the geosciences. So our project launched a workplace climate survey through the societies that you see listed at the bottom. So AGU, GSA, Soil Science Society of America, the Science Women's Network, and Association for Women Geoscientists. In the fall and winter, right before the pandemic. So the data that we're showing you is pre-pandemic. And we asked about both positive and negative experiences in the workplace. And we defined the workplace as a place of work and study. So this was open to students, undergraduate students, so over 18 years of age. And we assessed attitudes about, characteristics of, and experiences in the current workplace. And we limited our questions to the last 12 months. And this is because we wanted to be able to reliably assess the frequency of different types of experiences. We recognize that this is just a snapshot in time, and that we miss out on things that might have happened before that time or over people's careers, which is also important. And the survey was delivered over via Qualtrics. We had almost 3,500 surveys and about a little bit over 2,000 that had enough completion with demographic data that I'll be showing you today. In the box here, I have a summary of the survey demographics. You can see the demographics of the survey in some ways match the demographics of the geosciences discipline. And in other ways, some groups such as women are overrepresented in our survey. No surprise seeing our partners, but we had about 86% of respondents were white. Almost 14% identified another race or ethnicity or more than one. We asked, we asked beyond the gender binary. So we had 50% women, 46% men, 1.3% non-binary, 1% transgender, a little over 10% identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, pansexual, asexual, or other non-heterosexual identities. About 7% identified as disabled or with a disability. We had most of our survey respondents had a PhD as the highest degree earned, followed by master's and 10% bachelor's. And we actually had a pretty large percentage of first generation respondents. So 25% had been first generation undergraduate degrees, and almost half of them were first generation grad degrees. So we're going to start with some positive experiences. So overall, we found that more than 70% experienced positive interactions with their peers in the workplace. This is good. We can see lots of dark blue colors represent greater frequency. So a lot of people saying they, many times and often experiencing someone showing them genuine concern or courtesy, someone noticing when they did their best possible work, someone going out of their way to help them with a work-related problem, someone expressing interest in work-related opinions, and respectful treatment. On the other hand, we found that 37% reported never or only once or twice receiving public recognition for their work. So we start seeing some of these pro-social interactions being less frequently observed. We found overall between 1/3 and 40% of our survey respondents experienced insulting remarks, devaluation of their work, and bullying or intimidation. Let's look at differences between identities. And I'll mention that at this stage of the analysis, we are only looking at comparisons within different types of identity. And we'll talk a little bit about what we're missing so far in terms of not having an intersectional lens to our data yet. So we found that non-binary respondents overwhelmingly and women experience more interpersonal mistreatment. So across all the different questions that we asked in terms of what psychologists have defined as incivility or interpersonal mistreatment, we're finding strong differences by gender identity. And we're seeing that if you limit your questions to the binary gender, you're actually missing those people in our community who are experiencing some of the most negative environments. And we saw that across the board, non-binary individuals experienced the most negative workplace environments. We find that lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, pansexual, asexual, and other non-heterosexual identity respondents experienced greater interpersonal mistreatment as well, compared to those who did not identify as LGBTQIA. And this is in terms of receiving insulting remarks, being bullied or intimidating, fearing for their physical safety, and experiencing devaluation of their work and efforts. Geoscientists of color also experience greater devaluation of their work and efforts compared to white geoscientists in our survey. And we found that geoscientists who identify as disabled or as having a disability, and I intentionally use both those terms, recognizing that that disability activists, different people prefer different terminologies, also experience more negative workplaces in terms of bullying, fear for physical safety, insulting remarks, and devaluation of their work and efforts. We found also differences by career stage. So students, postdocs, and trainees were twice as likely to experience sexual harassment in this case, but also experienced more negative workplace environments across the board. We found that gender harassment was the common denominator of all forms of sexual harassment. So more than 96% of individuals who reported experiencing one form of sexual harassment reported experiencing gender harassment. And this is really important because the National Academy of Sciences came out with a report in 2018 focused on sexual harassment in scientific disciplines. And they concluded that most attention was being focused on unwanted sexual attention and coercion. But that gender harassment, which is often hardly even recognized by people who are experiencing it, less so by some of the policies we have in our workplaces, is really, really pervasive and can be equally detrimental and harmful. And we're finding that in our survey in terms of its prevalence. And then looking at specific groups, we found overall 14% of our survey respondents reported experiencing sexual harassment. And remember, this might look like a small number, but this is just over the last 12 months. We found that different groups experience much greater than average sexual harassment. So more than half of non-binary respondents in our survey reported experiencing some form of sexual harassment. 33% of LGBTQPA+, 20% of women, 26% of disabled respondents, and 17% of geoscientists of color reported experiencing sexual harassment. We also asked questions about the use of alcohol. And we found that 39% of respondents indicated that alcohol is present sometimes, often, or always in professional settings. And almost half, 47%, stated that alcohol is present at least sometimes, often, or always during fieldwork. We found overall people felt generally comfortable or didn't have that strong opinions towards the presence of alcohol, but we did find that groups that have been historically excluded or are more vulnerable in academic environments and educational environments, and we've seen already from our survey, are experiencing some of the most negative workplace environments, also reported experiencing the most discomfort with the presence of alcohol. So for example, 23% of our early career respondents were more likely to feel uncomfortable with the amount of alcohol consumed in professional settings compared to other career stages. 33% of non-binary individuals were less likely to feel comfortable compared to 20% of women and 13% of men. And geoscientists of color were more likely to feel discomfort with alcohol consumption, 23% versus 16% of white geoscientists. So we're starting to see, potentially some important, and the need for some important conversations in our discipline, both in terms of the presence of alcohol in professional settings, such as conferences or in the workplace, as well as during fieldwork. And I know that there's already conversations being had by some of our professional societies around this topic as well. So in addition to assessing the frequency and type of workplace experiences, we wanted to know if these experiences were related to professional outcomes. And the way we designed our survey, we aren't actually able to ascertain what a certain causality necessarily, but we can definitely see if things are related. And we're finding that negative experiences have professional consequences. So we're finding pretty large, this is just looking across across our entire survey pool. We're finding almost half of respondents reporting avoiding their colleagues because of negative experiences. That is pretty significant, right? Think about the work that you can't do well if you're avoiding your colleagues. About 30% or so considered leaving their institution. We see large percentages, more than 25% considered career change. So some pretty important professional consequences. And you can probably imagine that we also see historically excluded groups reporting disproportionately greater negative professional consequences. So let's look at some of that data. So here we see 68%. Those are huge numbers. 60% of non-binary geoscientists were more likely to consider a career change, followed by 39% of women than 21% of men. 52% of non-binary geoscientists were more likely to consider leaving their discipline, followed by 25% of women than 11% of men. Disabled geoscientists were more likely to skip a professional activity, 33% versus 20% of those who did not disclose a disability. Were more likely to consider a career change, 41% versus 29%, and we're also more likely to consider leaving the discipline, leaving the geosciences. So we have 29% of disabled geoscientists versus 18% of geoscientists who did not disclose a disability. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, pansexual, asexual, and other non-heterosexual respondents were also more likely to consider a career change, 48% versus 29%, and to consider leaving their discipline, 30% versus 17%. And I recognize that so far the data that I've presented in terms of race and ethnicity has looked at just two groups, geoscientists of color and white geoscientists. And of course, that hides a lot of differences that we might see. We could expect differences even between certain people who identify as the same race, but definitely when you lump all non-white races and ethnicities together. And we did that for the simplicity of analysis, but I wanted to show you here some differences by groups. And so this is looking at disproportionate impacts on careers by respondent race and ethnicity. And you can see that across all these groups, we have large proportions of our community considering leaving their institution. We got similar numbers if you look at leaving, considering a career change or leaving the discipline altogether. So we see white respondents, 38% considering leaving their institution. American Indian, Native American, Alaska Native, First Nations person, and Indigenous persons, 33%, 50% of Black, African American, or African survey respondents saying that they're considered leaving their institutions because of their negative experiences. And you can see pretty large percentages across the board. Okay, so that is a lot of data to digest. And I want to move on to kind of think about, what does this all mean? And then open it up for discussion and think about, how do we take this information as a discipline? And so moving forward, I think that the data that our group has collected, which is supported by surveys that have been done in other disciplines as well, by other teams, shows that in order to address persistent problems of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to address hostile workplace environments. We need to address behaviors, not just like sexual harassment, which are illegal, but also other behaviors such as bullying and intimidation, negative interpersonal mistreatment that are not illegal, but can also have really significant negative consequences, not only on career outcomes, but also on people's well-being. So we need to address hostile workplace behaviors. Surveys, of course, are just one tool to understand people's experiences, and there are limitations to surveys. Data are a snapshot and reflect frequency of experiences, not long-term career impacts. And of course, a one-dimensional analysis misses the importance of intersectionality and within group differences. And we have a parallel analysis right now that with a larger survey pool, including the ecological and environmental sciences, where we're looking at differences among taking an intersectional lens and actually testing some models from the psychology literature to try to look at specific workplace characteristics to try to identify what are some good predictors in these disciplines for understanding whether these behaviors are happening or not. So we can better kind of tailor our interventions. And then thinking really about our methods, right? Broad community surveys are useful, but they can miss a lot of people, and they should be complemented with other qualitative analyses such as focus groups to better capture experiences of groups with smaller demographics. And so, for example, our team led by Dr. Allison Matthias who's a social scientist in our teams, has been doing some focus groups, and I wanted to read a quote here from a participant. And so it was strange to be in a place where I'm out in the woods with these straight homophobes with hammers. And so it was like a legitimate safety concern in thinking about whether or not to disclose. A portion of my brain was not on collecting rocks and charting outcrops. It was focused on like, am I acting gay and am I safe? So this quote, I think, nicely captures some of these hostile workplace experiences that we're talking about. And also, I think, illustrates the value that qualitative data has for highlighting some of these experiences. Okay, So we need to think about changing culture and climate at all levels, thinking about what can we do as individuals, what can we do as members of departments and teams, what can we do as parts of our institutions and organizations. And we need to also bring in funding agencies and professional societies as partners in changing expectations for our discipline. And so what I want to do for the next few minutes is just kind of run through some strategies that our team has been thinking about, and then open it up for a broader conversation. So at the individual level, there's a lot we can be doing in terms of educating ourselves, interrogating our own practices, and thinking about, how do we interact with others in the workplace. And I'm citing here from a paper by Chaudhry and Dr. Berhe, Dr. Chaudhry and Dr. Berhe, 10 Simple Rules for Building an Anti-Racist Lab, that hopefully most of you have seen. And they outline the need to shift our culture to intentionally implement equitable and inclusive policies, set norms and expectations for acceptable conduct, and provide opportunities for career advancement. I think those are a good outline of how we can move forward. And then thinking about how can we challenge the way it's always been? How can we interrogate our own assumptions, the assumptions of our peers, our practices, policies, and relationships? And think about, how do we do science? Is the way we do our science, the way we teach our science, the most equitable, inclusive way? Or can we change our assumptions, practices, and policies and the way we interact with people? And then that last point, how we interact with people, is really important as well. Thinking it's not just how do we do our science, but how do we treat our people? How do we treat people in our classrooms, in our labs, in their field work, in our conferences, in our meetings? And just like we started with a land acknowledgement, recognizing that we need to understand the history of our discipline and the history of our institutions to understand where we are. And so often as geoscientists, we haven't been exposed to the social history of academia, of STEM. And that's so important to understand, just some of the persistent trends that we see, and recognize that our disciplines and our academic institutions were intentionally built to exclude. And so unless we change, fundamental things about our culture and our institutions, we can't just magically expect them to be more equitable, accessible, and inclusive. And there's some good references, some good resources here to start conversations about that topic. And ultimately, that part of this interrogation and part of this awareness requires that we redesign our STEM education. And most of you here on the seminar with the NAGT are working on this, and I wanted to point out some excellent resources put together by early career scientists, Geocontext, the social and political context for geoscience education, on the CERC website. And this is one attempt to start thinking about those histories of our disciplines and thinking about how do we bring that into our classroom. We also need to very actively practice intentionality in all aspects of our work. And this, I think, provides great opportunities for many points of inflection where we can actually cultivate change, and we can actually transform our disciplines and our organizations. And so this is from Dr. Ali's et al., an actionable anti-racism plan for geoscience organizations, thinking about recognizing the importance of identity, and thinking about, let's bring in our values, let's bring in justice, let's bring in equity, let's bring in accessibility and inclusion into thinking about how do we make our disciplines and our institutions more fair and equitable. Of course, want to make sure that everybody's aware of the Unlearning Racism in the Geosciences program that has some excellent resources for starting and continuing these conversations as research teams. In order to do this and address some of these exclusionary behaviors, we need to disincentivize unethical behavior, and some of our professional societies have taken great leaps forward and starting to do this. And I know the American Geophysical Union, the Geological Society of America, other organizations have revised their ethics policies to define discrimination, harassment, and bullying as scientific misconduct, and really think about, how do we treat our people is as important as how we treat our data in science. And we need to prioritize safety and recognize that to do so, we need to include conversations about diversity, equity, inclusivity, and accessibility into our conversations about safety, both in the field as well as in the lab and in the classroom. And there's been some excellent resources collected by our community over the last several years for how to do this. And here's some of those. And of course, in order to think about building more equitable classrooms, research groups, and teams, we need to think about reinventing mentoring and reinventing the types of relationships that we build with people, and move away from these medieval style hierarchical models, and thinking more about how do we work in communities and how do we build culturally relevant practices into our mentoring. Almost finally, we need to recognize that it takes work to do this, and that right now we are expecting those who are disproportionately negatively impacted by exclusionary behaviors to do this work. And we know we don't only not value this labor of care, but we often actually penalize people for doing this labor. And so we actually need to completely transform that framework and thinking about how do we value the work that people are doing to build our communities, to maintain our organizations safe and equitable and accessible. And how do we recognize that work? And that falls into finally thinking about, how do we redefine excellence and professional success in our classrooms, in our organizations, in the field, and our conferences, and recognizing that we need to be intentional about the spaces and the relationships that we're building. And finally, I wanted to finish with a shout out to incredible grassroots organizations across our community, most of these led by early career scientists that are doing this work, that are building networks for transformation, and thinking about, as more senior career scientists, how can we support these efforts? How can we value these efforts and leverage this work and contribute, kind of our responsibility and hold ourselves accountable for a more equitable geosciences. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
Excellent, Erica. Thank you so much. If I can jump in with the first question, because I got a direct message question. So the question actually is to go back to your reinventing mentoring slide. Mm-hmm. And if you can talk a little bit more about what that means and looks like, as well as the report that you have pictured on the PowerPoint.
Sure. So this is a report from the National Academies of Sciences. If you just Google NASEM, Science of Effective Mentorship, you can get access to the report. And there's been a lot of conversations about, kind of our traditional model of advising in many science disciplines is this dyad model, right? Where you have an advisor and an undergraduate student or a graduate student. And there's a lot of potential for, there's both a lot of potential for abuse in this power dynamics where students depend on one person, right, for access to resources, letters of recommendation, not just the students, but throughout the rest of their career for funding, et cetera. And so there's that potential for abuses of power that happen. At the same time, it's too much to demand of one person, right, to be able to satisfy all needs for your students. And so really recognizing that, we're much better off when we have teams of mentors And when we recognize, we can build communities and networks of mentors and sponsors and advisors. And so there's a lot of really, innovative work that has been done in this sphere, which has been summarized in this NASEM report, really thinking about, different models and how do we apply those, to our organizations. And I'll leave it at that because there's a lot to say about that. You can also look at the work by Dr. Baranda Montgomery, so I think at Michigan State, who's published a lot on thanks Pranoti. He's published a lot on this, thinking about different mentorship styles as well. She might be at University of Michigan. I'll have to check.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. So Jane says, often students get support from minoritized scientists who are then retaliated against for supporting students. To my knowledge, faculty who support students or give them spaces in labs are not often thought about in terms of retaliation. Of course, I don't want to detract from the horrible experience the students have.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jane, for bringing it up. And the truth is that we do an awful job at protecting people from retaliation. And you're right that it's not just students who are retaliated against, but especially faculty and staff in more vulnerable positions, either because of their, their identity or because their early career. And so I think that's where we're thinking about cultivating, what Dr. Kate Clancy and colleagues wrote about in terms of brave leadership and courageous leadership, right? And thinking about, how do we build in systems of accountability where people cannot get away with retaliation, and how do we build systems of support, not just for our students, but for everybody who's supporting our students. And that's where I think, even learning from some of these models of community mentoring might be really useful to think about how do we apply that to kind of researchers and staff as well. And then Anita, when can we start citing the study? Do we have to wait until you publish? That's a good question. We've been presenting. We're hoping to be able to submit the paper maybe next week, but we have presented the results, and so reach out if we can help you think about how to cite this in upcoming work. Any other questions about the data, other strategies? I know that we have a lot of experts in the room as well, and I'd love to have people share, how their organizations or their departments might have addressed some of these hostile and exclusionary behaviors that we've been finding in our survey, or thinking about other strategies that you found to be effective.
Maybe I can jump in, Erica. I know this is beyond the scope of exactly what you were doing, but I'm curious how the geosciences compare to other disciplines when it comes to some of these hostile experiences, harassing experiences, and so on.
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's been some surveys. There's been a lot of work done in engineering and physics and in medical schools, and in biology as well. And the geosciences differ from some other disciplines, not necessarily from physics and engineering, but from some other disciplines in terms of just the low diversity of race and ethnicity, but also gender diversity as compared to biological sciences. And the truth is that, these types of behaviors are prevalent. They can be, I would say that some of the percentages might be greater or smaller in some disciplines. And we conducted the same survey in the ecological and environmental sciences, and we're finding fewer statistically significant, let's say, differences among groups in that survey than in the geosciences. But overall, the story is the same and the patterns and trends are the same. So I don't think they're that different. There's a question in the chat about working on replicating the survey in other countries. We actually are communicating with a group in Europe that is actually interested. Is Dr. Andrea Pop et al. They published a survey for the international geosciences community a few years ago, and they're interested in running a similar survey as well. So hopefully we'll have some global data. We did not ask for country of origin or citizenship in our survey, kind of intentionally, but we did survey US-based but international societies. So, we're not able to discern, how many of our respondents were based in the US or not. But it would be nice to be able to intentionally get a more international audience. Okay, so more data from the study. There's a lot of data, if any, about what positive experiences impacts that solutions can be modeled upon, focus groups, anything. Yeah, so our next kind of analysis of this is going to be combining the 2,000 plus responses that we have from the Geosciences survey, plus the 1,000 plus from the Ecological and Environmental Sciences survey, and actually start testing. There's some models in psychology that look at kind of antecedents, like what are some workplace, both positive and negative workplace kind of conditions that might lead to some of these behaviors being more prevalent or not. So we can start maybe teasing apart. And so we have questions about representation in the workplace. So we can look at, relationships between, our people in places that have more diverse peers and supervisors, maybe experiencing more positive types of workplace, behaviors, and experiencing fewer of the more negative, but starting to look at relationships between those positive and negative behaviors to see if we can come up with some specific, tailored recommendations. And then people's strategies for first day of class lab for icebreakers or activities to help students be more comfortable from day one. I will open that up and see if anybody would like to answer that question. I can answer the second part of that. I'm actually really bad with icebreakers, so I'm not going to give you a good example of icebreakers, but there's probably people in the room who have some good examples. But I use I didn't do it at the beginning of the talk here, but usually in the classroom, I use my pronouns when I introduce myself, and I have a student information, little student questionnaire that I ask people to give me their pronouns. I know that I've heard conversations where, forcing people to share their pronouns where people might not feel comfortable might not be the best, the best suggestion, but that definitely normalizing the use of pronouns. And then, I try to use they just when I'm talking about students and not, call out she or he necessarily, so that if there is a they in the room, they don't feel singled out. Great, thanks. And there's probably some good references, some good examples of icebreakers on some of the CERC resources as well. That's a great idea, Julie. Introduce your pronouns and your TS pronouns and invite students to submit a one-slide introduction to themselves. That's a good way of getting people to share. Yeah, I think one of the things that I find particularly interesting about our survey is, the findings of non-binary individuals experiencing across the board the most negative, the most negative behaviors, and that's, I think, really timely right now because there's a lot of conversations, in the scientific community about thinking, beyond the gender binary and even making sure that NSF is asking questions, right, that are more inclusive of different identities, both in terms of gender identity as well as, LGBTQ status, for example. Yeah, Daryl.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. It was really great. Thank you so much for everything you're working on. I was wondering if you, from talking and also a lot of the resources that you shared, have you gotten a sense of where geologists and other geoscientists look for these types of resources? I'm thinking in terms of like, the GeoAscend or all these other efforts, like as we're developing toolkits or whatever people are doing, different organizations focusing on different groups, where do you think would be the most useful place to have like a repository? I know like a lot of the geoscience education community has been really focused on CERC. So I wonder if that might be the best place to have something like that, or if that is the place where geoscientists are looking for these resources.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. That's a really good question, and that's where I've been going is to CERC, and actually just noticed that GeoContext has a new CERC website, and that's where we have our resources. The Advanced Geo Project has been compiling resources as well for thinking about creating inclusive workplace climates, dealing with harassment and bullying. We're just about to launch an anti-racism resources website as well. And one thing that we've been trying to do is, we're developing some of our own resource, but also be a hub for other groups' resources as well, so that we can point to kind of what's happening in the community. So I think that's a good place to start. But if you have any other recommendations, and then I know through social media, right, Twitter has been a really good place for sharing. But if you have recommendations of other places that we could also be making sure we're reaching broader audiences, would be really valuable.
So Sandra had a question here about how we can evaluate self-selection, that many minorities don't even start in the geosciences because of the perceptions of the discipline.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's where, kind of recognizing, some of the challenges and perceptions of the geosciences and where that comes from historically, and also, where that comes from in terms of the types of experiences that people are still having in the geosciences, and then addressing that as a discipline, and thinking about our recruitment and kind of outreach efforts are really important in terms of recognizing that not everybody has to be out in the field as a geoscientist, right? That there's a lot of different ways of being an Earth or geoscientists, and that we don't have to ascribe to these historical stereotypes that are very exclusionary. And then thinking as well about, how do we, it's not just about recruiting people into the field, but how do we make sure that we're bringing people into an environment that is not going to be harmful. So thinking about, right, as our project is trying to do, is recognize what might be some of the factors contributing to low retention. And if we can kind of clean up our house a little bit, hopefully we can make our discipline more appealing as well to people to come in. And Chris is sharing, when I have new students join the lab, I announce my pronouns, ask all the new students to wear a name tag for the first lab meeting or two. So everyone has the opportunity to include their pronouns and people can learn everyone's names, and creates a culture in the lab where we all use and respect identities. Great. Anybody else want to share? I'm curious. I know that, again, we've got people here from different institutions and with a lot of varied teaching experience as well. And I'd love to hear, some other strategies that you might use to think about dealing with some of these exclusionary behaviors. Or if there's anything in the data that you found surprising. Because we'll often present this data and people will be like, well, that's not surprising. Which is good. That means there's more awareness.
And I'll put in a quick plug if I can. So NAGT has a program called the Traveling Workshop Program that I'm the chair of. And so if you are interested in doing strategic planning or having deep discussions at your institution, we send 2 facilitators to work with your program or department. I have put in the chat just now the link to that page. We have a variety of different flavors of workshop, including supporting all students, which is on the diversity, equity, and inclusion end of things. But there's also just more building a strong department and strategic planning writ large, which can include aspects of having an inclusive department or program. So, that last question of like, how do I know what happens to the people who didn't become majors or part of this discipline? We can have facilitators work with you to figure out what data are at your institution where you could find that out. And our facilitators talk to students on your behalf to figure out, why did they choose to come in, and people who didn't, what happened with them. So please reach out to me if you're interested, or look on the website. Okay, any other questions or comments?
Great, and I put in the chat a link to the ADVANCEGeo Partner resources as well, which again are a good repository of what's happening in the community. And if you know of anything that should be on here, or you would like to highlight your program, send me an email and let me know.
Excellent. Well, Erica, thank you so much. This was fascinating. And I think I echo the comments about when can we cite this, where I think everyone is excited to see this actually in print, and really appreciate the presentation today.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the great questions.
Awesome, thanks again. I just posted a link to the chat to our webinar evaluation. So if you all could take a second to fill out the really quick survey and let us know what you thought of this webinar, what you learned, how it went. This is super helpful for us to get a feel and to provide more webinars like this in the future. So please take a second to do that. And thank you again, Erica and Catherine, for a great presentation today.